The story begins in the year 1852 on a large plantation in the southern United States, a plantation whose vast lands, number of enslaved people, and imposing buildings make it clear that its owner is a wealthy and influential man, a man known throughout the region and whose power has long been accepted by those around him. He has everything: fertile land, great wealth, social influence, and hundreds of enslaved people whose lives and labor depend entirely on his decisions. Yet despite this appearance of completeness, one fundamental absence weighs heavily on his life. He has no son to serve as the direct heir to his name and property. His wife died years earlier, leaving no opportunity for another child, and all that remains of his family are 3 adult daughters who have never married. In the society in which this story takes place, this situation is not merely a personal or family matter, but a serious threat, because women, even when white and wealthy, without a husband or a son, possess no real power or secure future, and cannot legally own land or act as primary decision-makers. If this story resonated with you and you'd like to hear more stories like it, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. The father knows well that if he dies, the plantation and all his holdings will pass by law to his nephews and other male relatives, and his daughters will be effectively erased from what he built. This realization gradually and obsessively consumes his thoughts, turning the idea of continuing the bloodline into his central concern, a thought that slowly dominates his mind and keeps him awake at night, imagining a future in which his name no longer exists. The 3 daughters are introduced, all intelligent, independent, and fully aware of their position in society. They have consciously chosen not to marry, not because they lack suitors, but because they see marriage as the loss of identity and control over their own lives. They do not want their futures tied to another man or lived under the authority of a husband's decisions. Yet what they see as independence is, in their father's eyes, a failure, one that is not merely personal, but a blow to the family's legacy and reputation. Alongside this silent tension within the household, the story turns to another figure, an enslaved man who has lived on the plantation since childhood and has spent his entire life under the complete control of his owner. He is physically strong, more resilient than most, and unlike many others, he is literate and intelligent. The father has invested in him for years and regards him as the best specimen among his enslaved people, not as a human being, but as a valuable asset whose usefulness can be calculated and relied upon. In the father's worldview, people are measured by efficiency and utility, and there is no real distinction between enslaved laborers, hired workers, or even members of his own family. Episode 1 ends with the formation of a dangerous idea. The father begins to place 2 undeniable realities side by side: 3 adult daughters, each at an age society deems suitable for marriage and childbearing, and a man who has been raised on the plantation and kept entirely under his control. In his mind, these 2 realities slowly merge into a single equation he believes can be solved without emotion. He has not yet spoken of this idea to his daughters, but the change in his behavior is visible to everyone. Family gatherings grow shorter and more formal, conversations diminish, and the house takes on a cold, calculated atmosphere. The daughters sense that something is forming, though they do not know what, and this uncertainty makes them increasingly anxious. They know that in this house, decisions are always made from above, and once announced, there is no room for resistance. Meanwhile, the man who has drawn the story's focus also senses the change. He has learned over the years that being watched too closely means being selected for a specific role, one he will not be asked to accept and will not be able to refuse. The father begins to examine details, timing, and methods that would allow everything to remain hidden from others. He convinces himself that if this is done in silence, no one beyond the plantation will ever know. The daughters remain unaware of the plan taking shape, but an invisible distance grows between them and their father, marked by longer silences, heavier looks, and carefully measured replies, signs of a decision drawing near. The father believes this decision is not driven by personal desire, but by necessity, a necessity that, in his mind, justifies any action. Episode 1 ends at the moment when nothing has yet been spoken aloud, but every required element is in place. 3 adult daughters with uncertain futures, a man with no control over his own life, and a father prepared to cross boundaries society would never allow openly, as the story closes with the sense that the decision has already been made. Only its announcement remains.
As several weeks pass, the signs become impossible to ignore. Behavior has changed, the order of the household has shifted, and everyone knows that something is coming, even if it still has no name. The change is not sudden, but gradual, so slow that no one can identify the exact moment it began, yet so clear that no one can deny it. The father spends more time in his study, sitting for hours behind closed doors, and his presence in the shared spaces of the house becomes brief, limited, and carefully calculated. Everyday interactions give way to short, formal exchanges, and every sentence sounds more like a declaration of position than a family conversation. The 3 daughters sense this change, not through direct words, but through the distance that slowly forms between them and their father, a distance visible in glances that end too quickly, in long pauses before answers, and in the gradual disappearance of any former warmth. They know well that when the atmosphere becomes like this, it means an important decision is being finalized without their involvement. Years of living in this house have taught them that the father's silence is rarely a sign of calm. More often, it is the prelude to a decisive and irreversible choice. At the same time, the man who has lived on the plantation for years also notices that his daily routine has changed. His tasks are defined more precisely and more narrowly. His movements are watched more closely than before. His contact with others is reduced, and his place on the plantation is determined with greater care. He understands clearly that this kind of attention is never accidental and usually means being chosen for a role that comes without explanation and without the possibility of refusal. Experience has taught him that when the order of his surroundings shifts in this way, it means he has become part of a plan that was never designed with his consent. The father, meanwhile, reviews the details in silence, going over timelines again and again in his mind, measuring places and arranging paths that would keep everything hidden from the outside world. He believes that if this course is taken quietly, without witnesses, and without any official record, no one beyond the plantation will ever discover what is happening. The distance between the father and the daughters grows wider, not through open conflict or direct threats, but through the increasing formality of their relationship, shorter replies, and the deliberate removal of any unnecessary conversation. The daughters think more at night and speak less, sensing that every word might draw them closer to a decision they are not yet ready to hear. The house takes on a cold, orderly, and calculated atmosphere, and even the servants become more cautious than before, as if everyone knows they must see less and hear less. Eventually, the father decides the time is right and summons his 3 daughters to the room that has always been used for important decisions, a room whose walls have witnessed agreements and arrangements that altered the lives of others. The door is closed, and a heavy silence fills the space. The father begins to speak without preamble, not with emotion, and not with long explanations, but with his usual cold precision. He speaks of the future, of laws that work against them, and of the fact that time is no longer on the family's side. He explains that opportunities have narrowed and choices have become fewer than before. At first, the daughters believe these words are the beginning of pressure towards forced marriage and try to prepare themselves to hear such demands, but they soon realize that the matter is far more serious and dangerous than they expected. When the father points to a solution that quietly bypasses society's unwritten rules, shock and disbelief appear clearly on all 3 faces. Objections arise, questions follow one another, and fear is unmistakable in their eyes. But the father remains calm and unmoved. He made this decision long ago, and now he is merely announcing it. In his view, this action is not driven by personal desire, but by necessity, a necessity he believes is the only way to preserve the family's future.
He presents his decision as logical, unavoidable, and without alternative, insisting that this path is the best option available. Episode 2 continues to the moment when the daughters gradually understand that they are not facing a real choice, but a predetermined path, a path designed without their consent and destined to reshape their lives, a path in whose creation none of them had any role, and from which only silence, acceptance, and obedience are now expected.
The decision had been spoken, but its consequences were only beginning to reveal themselves, and the house was slowly turning into a place where no one felt safe. The 3 daughters had each returned to their own rooms, yet none of them was truly alone. Their minds were crowded with voices that refused to quiet down, their father's words sinking into their thoughts like heavy weights, taking on new meanings each time they resurfaced. What they had heard felt less like the start of a discussion and more like the announcement of a final outcome, as if everything had already been decided and roles were now simply being assigned. One of the daughters tried to approach the situation logically, reviewing laws, weighing official avenues, and searching for even the smallest crack in the wall before her, but every attempt led back to the same point, where law, custom, and power converged and left no passage through. She slowly realized that what had always been presented as order had now become a tool to erase her from a future that should have been hers. The second daughter felt anger more deeply than the others, not the kind that explodes into shouting or destruction, but a compressed, silent rage that gathered inside her chest with no outlet. She thought about the years in which she had consciously chosen independence, only to see how that very choice had turned into a weakness her father could now use against her. The third daughter was consumed most of all by fear, a paralyzing fear born not only of what was to come, but of the realization that none of her reactions would change the outcome. They knew that open resistance could make everything worse, while silence would be interpreted as acceptance, and this tension kept them suspended in an unbearable in-between state. On the other side of the plantation, the man whose name had not been spoken during the meeting, yet whose presence loomed large in the decision, felt the changes with his entire being. His routes had become more restricted, glances lingered on him longer, and orders were delivered with sharper precision than before. He understood that he was no longer merely labor, but part of a design that had taken shape without his knowledge. Years of experience had taught him that when such order was imposed, it meant a new role was approaching, one neither chosen nor rejectable. In the meantime, the father appeared calmer and more methodical than ever, as if speaking the decision had lifted a burden from his mind and allowed him to focus entirely on execution. He observed behaviors, measured reactions, and even calculated silences. In his view, every response was data, and every piece of data had to be managed. He believed time was his greatest tool, because the more time passed, the more resistance would wear down, and the fewer options would remain. In the days that followed, the daughters spoke to one another less, not out of distrust, but out of fear of being overheard. The house became a place where every wall could be a witness, every pause could carry meaning, and every word could be used against the speaker. Steps grew quieter, movements more deliberate, as if everyone knew the smallest misstep could draw unwanted attention. Nights felt longer, sleep came with difficulty, and the future was no longer a distant idea, but something that disrupted breathing itself and weighed heavily on waking moments. The man on the plantation also stayed awake at night, not with hope for change, but with the awareness that a stage was approaching that lay completely beyond his control. He had endured for years, but now he understood that endurance alone would not be enough, and that he would have to prepare himself for a role whose shape and consequences were still unclear. The father continued to replay everything in his mind, not out of doubt, but for reassurance. He was certain he had chosen the correct path, and that any opposition could be resolved either through time or through pressure. From his perspective, what was unfolding was not cruelty, but necessity, and necessity always justified itself. The story moves forward to a point where all the characters, each in their own way, know that the next stage is close, even though no one knows exactly when it will begin. The daughters realize they must choose between preserving a small measure of control or fully submitting to the predetermined path, knowing that both choices carry a heavy cost.
The man understands that survival is no longer just endurance, but preparation for a role that will shape his future and perhaps change him forever. And the father looks ahead with cold confidence, certain that the pieces are in place, the path has been cleared, and the next move depends not on the will of others, but on time itself, the very force he has always relied upon.
A time comes when nothing in the house happens by chance anymore. Even the simplest actions seem pre-calculated, and every movement, every pause, every small change carries a hidden meaning. The father enters a phase that feels more familiar to him than any human emotion, a phase in which decisions no longer require justification and only need to be executed. He wakes earlier each morning, not because of sleeplessness, but because his mind is filled with details that must be reviewed one by one, hours, distances, routes, and people who must be seen less or not at all. Everything must be precise, because he knows the smallest mistake can attract unwanted attention, and attention is the one thing that can endanger everything. The daughters sense this change far sooner than they expect. Their daily routines shift subtly, their time in shared spaces grows shorter, and their movements take on a controlled, deliberate pattern. No one says anything directly, yet the repetition of these changes makes it impossible to dismiss them as coincidence. One of the daughters tries to behave as she always has, hoping that normalcy might serve as a shield, but each attempt meets an invisible barrier that cuts her path short and reminds her that new rules are quietly taking shape. Another daughter tries to break the silence, asking questions whose answers seem prepared in advance, responses that are brief, cold, and closed, signaling that conversation is no longer a tool for change. The third watches more than she acts, not out of indifference, but from the understanding that any impulsive move could bring consequences that cannot be undone. Slowly, they realize the house is no longer just a place to live, but a space where everyone has an assigned role, and stepping outside that role carries a cost. On the other side of the plantation, the man who now fully understands that he is part of the plan feels the pressure of this new order more intensely. Not through open threats, but through excessive precision. His work routes are clearer, his hours more exact, and his contact with others more limited than ever. He notices that even the looks directed at him have changed, lingering too long before being withdrawn. Years of experience have taught him that when such order takes hold, the time is near, not for choice, but for execution. Nights become moments of mental preparation for him, not because he hopes for change, but because he knows unpreparedness is more dangerous than anything else. Meanwhile, the father observes everything with calculated calm, measuring reactions, weighing silences, and recording even the smallest changes as signs. In his view, resistance is not an obstacle, but a number that can be reduced through time and pressure. Days pass and the atmosphere of the house grows heavier. Voices soften, footsteps become cautious, and conversations shorten. Even the servants speak less, as if everyone understands that being heard can be dangerous. In this prolonged silence, the daughters reach a bitter realization. The most dangerous part of what is happening is not the decision itself, but the loss of time. With each passing day, resistance becomes harder and options grow fewer. They try to find ways to coordinate with one another, but fear of being overheard and an unspoken mistrust leave every serious conversation unfinished. The man on the plantation feels the same truth. The distance between him and his past widens, while an undefined future slowly draws closer. He understands that he can no longer simply wait, and that he must be ready, even if readiness means accepting something he never wanted. The father replays everything in his mind, not out of doubt, but for reassurance. He sees signs others cannot see, silences that grow longer, objections that fade away, and an order that functions without repeated commands. To him, this means the path is ready, and when the path is ready, the next step does not need to be announced. The house gradually becomes a place where every decision moves forward without sound, and every change is accepted without explanation. The daughters realize they must find some way to preserve a minimal sense of control, even if that control exists only in how they respond. The man knows that soon he will no longer be a mere observer, and that the role assigned to him will inevitably draw him in. And the father looks ahead with cold composure, certain that once everything is in its place, the next phase will begin on its own, and that no one but him will determine the exact moment it does. Days arrive when waiting is no longer a temporary state, but becomes part of life itself, a form of waiting that leads neither to hope nor to protest, but instead spreads like a thick fog, covering everything and preventing anyone from seeing a clear image of tomorrow. In this atmosphere, the father moves more slowly, yet with greater certainty. He no longer feels the need to hide his pace, because he knows all paths have already been narrowed. The decisions in his mind have taken their final shape, and all that remains is the precise adjustment of timing and order of execution. He speaks less and watches more, recording every reaction as a sign of how much resistance has worn down, and from this collective silence he concludes that the pressure has done its work. The daughters, meanwhile, each find a different way to endure. One of them tries to occupy herself with daily details, retreating into repetitive tasks so her mind will wander less toward the future. Yet the repetition itself often exhausts her more than any direct thought ever could. Another tries to create a small sense of control through outward order, regulating hours, steps, even the way she sits, as if mastery over these details might mean that some fragment of choice still remains. The third grows increasingly withdrawn, her words fewer, her gaze deeper, her nights taking on more meaning than her days. She understands that silence is no longer merely the absence of sound, but a language everyone is now forced to speak. At times they pass one another in the narrow spaces of the house, exchanging looks that convey more than any conversation ever could. Yet none of them dares to turn those looks into words, because words have become the most dangerous thing of all. On the other side of the plantation, the man at the center of this quiet calculation feels the changes not only in schedules but in his own body, a constant pressure that lightens his sleep and keeps his senses permanently alert. He has learned that every change is felt in the air before it is announced, and now that air is heavier than ever. Orders have grown shorter, and the distance between command and execution has narrowed, as if there is no longer time for explanation. He knows this stage is one of preparation, not for choice, but for accepting a role whose full shape has yet to be revealed. Meanwhile, the father begins making small adjustments, not large enough to draw attention, but steady enough to alter paths. Meetings become fewer and more deliberate, and the presence of certain people in specific spaces grows increasingly restricted. He has come to believe that the most effective change is the one whose beginning no one can pinpoint. Days pass one after another with no major event, yet this very absence becomes a sign that everyone understands, because as time goes on, return becomes harder and adaptation to the new condition easier. The daughters slowly realize that even thinking about before has become more difficult, as if the past is turning into something distant and untouchable. They try to keep alive memories that once gave them a sense of strength, but those memories now feel more like reminders of something no longer accessible. The man on the plantation feels this shift as well, a distance growing between him and his former life, built not by walls, but by order. He understands that this new order is not temporary, but a prelude to fixing a situation from which return will be difficult. In his mind, the father concludes that time has worked well. Objections have turned into silence, silence into habit, and habit is exactly what he has always relied upon. He is certain that once habit takes hold, even the hardest changes can be carried out. The house now resembles a place where everyone knows what must not be said, and that knowledge alone regulates behavior. Servants ask fewer questions, pause less, and obey more, as if all have learned that questioning comes at a cost. In this enclosed space, the daughters begin to consider that resistance does not always mean open defiance, that sometimes it may exist only in preserving a part of oneself, in thought or in small reactions. The man also reaches the conclusion that he must prepare himself mentally, not to change the path, but to survive on a path he no longer chose. At the end of this phase, the father reaches a point of certainty that everything is in its proper place, not because of others' consent, but because of their exhaustion. He knows the next stage requires no formal announcement, because when everyone is ready, movement happens on its own, and this is the very moment he has been planning for all these years.
A moment arrives when everyone understands that it is no longer possible to simply wait. Even if no one says it out loud, the atmosphere itself enforces this truth. The father has now entered a phase in which time is neither an enemy nor a tool, but a silent accomplice that makes his work easier. He's no longer in a hurry, because he knows that everything left behind has already burned the paths of return, and everything ahead is simpler than it once seemed. He wakes each morning with a calmer mind than before, not from comfort, but from a cold certainty that all preparations are complete. He reviews each day as a small but significant unit, noting who was where, who spoke less, who remained silent longer, and which looks no longer carry their former resistance. In his mind, these are signs, indicators that the pressure has reached the desired point. The daughters, meanwhile, experience a deeper change, one that is no longer limited to behavior, but has taken root in how they feel about themselves. One of them notices that her reactions have slowed, not from indifference, but because her mind is constantly calculating consequences. Before any action, she runs through dozens of possibilities, and this endless evaluation drains her energy. Another feels her anger has taken on a new form. It no longer seeks release, but has become a force that keeps her awake, a force that prevents her from fully surrendering, even when no path to change seems possible. The third has turned inward more than ever, thinking about how much of oneself can be preserved when everything around is shifting, and whether preserving oneself always means resistance or sometimes simply endurance. They speak to each other less, yet feel each other's presence more strongly. The silence between them is no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding that requires no explanation. On the other side of the plantation, the man who knows that sooner or later he will be drawn into a new phase begins to organize his thoughts, not with hope of escape, but with an effort to understand how he might suffer the least harm. He realizes his body reacts faster than his mind. Tension in his shoulders, shallow sleep, sudden awakenings, all signs telling him that something is approaching. Orders have grown even shorter, as if explanation is no longer necessary, and execution without question is expected. The father sees this shift and approves of it. To him, this is the stage he has always planned for, a stage in which overt force is no longer needed because order itself carries everything forward. He has come to believe that the most effective control is the kind that remains unseen. The house has become a place where even ordinary sounds are measured. Doors close more softly, footsteps are lighter, and eyes meet less often. The servants have learned to anticipate what is desired before any instruction is given, and this anticipation leads to fewer mistakes. The daughters observe this and understand that the system has enveloped not only them, but everyone. This realization is both frightening and clarifying, because it shows that the issue is no longer merely a family decision, but a matter of power and habit. The man on the plantation reaches the same conclusion. He understands that he is no longer facing a single individual, but an order that has absorbed everyone into itself. He begins to practice silence, not a passive silence, but one that allows him to observe more and err less.
Meanwhile, the father senses that the precise moment is near, not because something has changed, but because there is nothing left to change. At night, before sleeping, he reflects on how everything has unfolded exactly as he predicted, without the need for open pressure or direct confrontation, relying only on time, repetition, and narrowing of options. In their private moments, the daughters begin to ask themselves how they will face the next stage, not in terms of changing the path, but in deciding what part of themselves they want to preserve. The man reaches the same question, wondering how he can remain himself on a path he did not choose, even if the meaning of self must change. The atmosphere moves forward as if everyone is standing on the edge of a great motion, one that has not yet begun, but whose presence is felt everywhere. The father is certain that when this motion begins, there will be no need for explanation, instruction, or justification, because everyone is already in place. This is the point he has waited years to reach, the point where time, silence, and habit have joined together to smooth the path completely.
A moment arrives when nothing can be postponed anymore, not because time has run out, but because everything has been invisibly locked into place. The father senses this sooner than anyone else, not with excitement or doubt, but with the same cold calm that has always marked the end of his calculations. He knows that the final stage does not begin with an announcement, but with acceptance, and now he sees the signs of that acceptance everywhere. In silences where resistance no longer exists, in looks emptied of questions, and in an order that functions without commands. The daughters, meanwhile, have each reached a point where they no longer resemble their former selves, not because they have surrendered, but because something within them has changed. One of them realizes that if anything of her is to remain, it must be kept hidden in a layer beyond the reach of decisions. She has learned to control her emotions, not to please others, but to keep a part of herself alive. The second has mastered her anger in a new way. It is no longer a fire, but a cold blade that keeps her alert. That anger reminds her that she is still alive, even when no choice exists. The third, however, has reached a different understanding. She has accepted that not all battles begin with shouting, and not all defeats end in silence. For her, survival has taken on a deeper meaning, one tied to endurance, observation, and remembering. They sit together less often, but when they do, their silence is heavy and meaningful, a silence that shows all three understand the end is near, not as an event, but as a result. On the other side of the plantation, the man who entered this path without choice has reached a threshold where he can no longer merely be prepared. He feels the role emerging from the shadows and taking shape, even if it still has no name. His body reacts, breaths shorten, focus sharpens. He realizes that complete control was never his. A moment arrives when nothing can be postponed anymore, not because time has run out, but because everything has been invisibly locked into place. The father senses this sooner than anyone else, not with excitement or doubt, but with the same cold calm that has always marked the end of his calculations. He knows that the final stage does not begin with an announcement, but with acceptance, and now he sees the signs of that acceptance everywhere. In silences where resistance no longer exists, in looks emptied of questions, and in an order that functions without commands. The daughters, meanwhile, have each reached a point where they no longer resemble their former selves, not because they have surrendered, but because something within them has changed. One of them realizes that if anything of her is to remain, it must be kept hidden in a layer beyond the reach of decisions. She has learned to control her emotions, not to please others, but to keep a part of herself alive. The second has mastered her anger in a new way. It is no longer a fire, but a cold blade that keeps her alert. That anger reminds her that she is still alive, even when no choice exists. The third, however, has reached a different understanding. She has accepted that not all battles begin with shouting, and not all defeats end in silence. For her, survival has taken on a deeper meaning, one tied to endurance, observation, and remembering. They sit together less often, but when they do, their silence is heavy and meaningful,
a silence that shows all three understand the end is near, not as an event, but as a result. On the other side of the plantation, the man who entered this path without choice has reached a threshold where he can no longer merely be prepared. He feels the role emerging from the shadows and taking shape, even if it still has no name. His body reacts, breaths shorten, focus sharpens. He realizes that complete control was never his, but the way he stands before what is coming still depends, to some extent, on him. This awareness is small, but vital. In the final stage, the father is seen less often, not out of secrecy, but because his constant presence is no longer necessary. The system has formed and now functions without him. He only observes, like someone who has planned for years and is now watching flawless execution. In his mind, he reviews how time, repetition, and the narrowing of options have worn even opposition into exhaustion. He does not call this victory, but necessity, and in his view, necessity has always stood above judgment. A day arrives when the change is no longer hidden, yet it remains silent. There is no official announcement, no added explanation, only a reality that imposes itself. The daughters feel this, not with sudden fear, but with a strange calm that comes from certainty. They know the path will no longer change, but each decides how she will walk it. The man understands the same, that he did not choose, but he can choose how he will be present. In the final moment, just before everything enters an irreversible phase, the father pauses briefly, not from doubt, but from assurance. He thinks of how the name, the power, and the legacy have been preserved as he intended, even if the cost is something others must pay. The story ends at a moment when all the characters stand in their places, not with satisfaction, not with passion, but with awareness. Awareness that what has happened is not the result of a single decision, but the outcome of a chain of silences, habits, and delays. The story closes on an image in which the house is quiet, the plantation orderly, and everything has unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Yet beneath this order, something has changed that can never be undone. Something that shows power does not always arrive with noise, and endings are not always announced with a shout. Sometimes an ending is simply the moment when everyone understands the story has no continuation, only consequences. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now, like the video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments section.